Zoo Frankfurt is one of the oldest zoos in Germany and at the same time probably one of the most important zoos in the world. But is it also one of the best? Should you definitely come and visit? Well, no and yes, it's complicated. But let's start at the beginning. Zoo Frankfurt was established in 1858. In the 1870s, the zoo moved to its current location, and the so-called Zoo Society House is from the same time. Obviously, the modern zoo entrance next to it is a little bit younger. It was opened in 2013. At the same time, a new area behind the main entrance was built, the so-called Ukumari land. Ukumari means bear in Quechua, a language family that was spoken by indigenous people from South America. If you put one and one together, or just look at the screen, you can already tell that this means that spectacled bears are living here. The old bear enclosures used to be at the same place. Sloth and sun bears were kept here till the end. However, as you can see from these videos from 1958, a wide variety of bear species have been kept here over time. Today, the spectacled bears are the only remaining bear species in Frankfurt, although Manu and Chimbo are not living here alone. The area offers 3 outdoor enclosures, each 500 square meters in size. As you can see, when I visited, the 2 bears were together in the same enclosure, but in the middle area they would be in company with bush dogs, which I was at least able to film from a distance. The third enclosure houses howler monkeys together with anteaters, but unfortunately I didn't get to see either of them. All in all, the new entrance area and the Ukumari land make for a very promising start to our zoo tour. The responsible architects of Hention and Reuter, who also planned the famous Gondwana land in Leipzig, have done a really good job here. The available space was used as good as possible for the animals, and visitors can enjoy great viewing points and an overall very coherent and immersive themed area. I also really like the playful approach to education here, even though there could be certainly more of it. Hopefully the new lion exhibit, which is currently under construction, will be just as good. And that leads us into the so-called Katzendschungel, where I obviously did not get to see any lions, and since the tigers were outside, their indoor facilities were also empty for the time being. The rusty spotted cat was not active, but just seeing it made me happy, because they are rarely kept in zoos. You can see them in only 4 zoos in Germany and 20 in all of Europe. Fossas are actually also not among the most common zoo animals, but I see them relatively often, especially in Duisburg. Nevertheless, I was really happy to get some really great shots here. And also, I have to say that this might be the best fossa enclosure that I know of. I especially like it because of its verticality. And not many fossa enclosures give you such a good look into the indoor area. Originally, this was a clouded leopard exhibit, so maybe that's the reason for this. Admittedly, I was particularly excited to see the tigers because they just had babies. Raja and Rimba were born on June 20th, 2023, so they are certainly a little bigger now. On my second day here, I was a little bit surprised that the 2 little Sumatran tigers were not growing up completely separated from their father. Although a while back in Berlin I already took some video evidence that clearly shows that something like this can work really well in a zoo if you know what you're doing. You just really have to know your animals. And that the whole tiger family harmonizes so beautifully with each other is a true blessing. Because, well, this tiger enclosure, which you can overlook wonderfully from a bridge, is quite big and overall really good. But this second area is really small, and I think it should be nothing more than a separation enclosure. But for me, that's the only real drawback in an otherwise very solid complex for big cats. You can just tell that it was built in the early 2000s. The only remnant from older times was the enclosure for Asiatic lions, the one that is being renovated now. I would love to see some more learning elements here, however the change from clouded leopards to fossas has already caused a didactic obstruction. This used to be a purely Southeast Asian cat jungle. On the large pond opposite the tiger enclosure, there were only 2 remaining pelicans left swimming around. There is also a gibbon island on the pond, however, the northern white-cheeked gibbons stayed in their indoor enclosure during my visit. Past the small clawed otters who live here in a small but nice enclosure, we continue towards the so-called Chimic house, which is, as the large bed above the entrance might suggest, a nocturnal house. In fact, it's one of the largest in the world. However, in the entrance and exit area there are also quite a lot diurnal animals living here. The golden spiny mouse, for example, which can only be found in 5 zoos all across of Europe. Since there are very few nocturnal houses in zoos in general, it's only logical that quite a lot of rarities can be found here. Suret's spiny mouses can only be found 6 times in Europe. Asian garden dormouses can only be found at one other place in Croatia. And Frankfurt also houses the only aye-ayes on the European mainland. In 2021 the aye-ayes had babies, which is a huge success considering that this species of lemur is highly endangered. And yes, after much consideration I have to say I found them to be rather cute than frightening. But regardless of how often certain species are kept, I think it's safe to say that the Chimic house always offers very special impressions and experiences. For example, I found it to be really exciting to observe coandus. I was really happy to see an aardvark, and active Australian echidnas are also something you do not see very often. And the almost goblin-esque grey slender lories, how they move, it's just amazing. Oh, and I was delighted to see eastern quolls. In Germany they are starting to be a little bit more common, but currently there are still only 4 places you can see them. And this more or less also applies to the Vench elephant shrews. There are now 5 places where you can see them. And that brings us back to the diurnal animals, where Komodo dragons, the largest lizards in the world, are definitely another highlight. Besides Leipzig, this is the only place in Germany where you can see them, but they should arrive in Cologne in the next few years. However, the biggest rarity here is probably the rufous elephant shrew. The only other place you can see them is my hometown of Düsseldorf, and according to Zootierliste, that applies worldwide. Nevertheless, in the end, my biggest highlights were the tamanduas. I mean, I love tamanduas, and seeing them this active and being able to film them, that just warmed my heart. I was so incredibly happy. That's why I almost overlooked the youngster among the Saki monkeys. I haven't shown and listed everything the Chimic house has to offer. It houses so many different species, and that definitely makes it something special. Like I said, it's one of the biggest nocturnal houses in the world. Even Berlin's zoo can't keep up here, so this really is an absolute unique selling point and special feature. However, when it comes to nocturnal houses, there's always an aspect of it you can criticize. The fact that their day and night rhythm is completely reversed, so to them it's night when it's actually daytime, well, that means those animals can't have any outdoor enclosures. That's no reason to demonize nocturnal houses, but in my opinion, animals that do not absolutely need to live with a reversed night and day cycle should preferably live in, well, normal enclosures, even if that means that visitors are less likely to see them. In order not to stumble straight back into the next house with, well, maybe even more species, let us come back for the Exotarium later, and the great apes will have to wait as well. Instead, we go behind this playground and say hi to the chaos. Thankfully, they are living in a rather big aviary here, just like the tree kangaroo right next to them, which I only got to see in his indoor enclosure. The Kiwi Information Center is also located here, but unfortunately you do not get to see those cute New Zealanders. The Kiwis are kept behind the scenes in order to maintain a very successful breeding program. In 2021, Frankfurt celebrated its 50th Kiwi hatchling. Next up, there is something to see again with the African wild dogs, but only through a thick, ugly mesh fence. Overall, this enclosure won't win any trophies. On the opposite side of the path is a mixed species enclosure for addax and adra gazelles, which I found to be way better. Two beautiful species, both of which are unfortunately threatened with extinction. In terms of space, maybe even more species could be added here. And I'm sorry, do you hear that too? Who is complaining? Oh yes, I'm sorry, I forgot about you. Of course, Guinea fowls also live here. And with that, we have arrived in the world of birds. First, we make our way into the bird bushes for walk-through biotope aviaries, which can certainly provide an experience. I was able to take some very nice shots of the red-legged Sirima, who remained completely unimpressed by me. Well, aside from my shoes. He found my shoes to be very interesting.
Hey, du!
Of course, being able to get up close to the birds here is really great, although I have to say that especially scarlet ibises and kettle egrets can be encountered in much larger walk-in aviaries elsewhere. Right next door is the birdhouse, the so-called Faustvogelhallen, where things are starting to get a little bit more problematic. In the first hall there is still a quite impressive collection of small birds. Examples are Guldian finch, Cuban grass squid, red siskin, blue-crowned hanging parrot, or purple honey creeper. In the next hall, things are a bit bigger in every respect. Here you will find many other bird species such as common trumpeters, blue-winged kookaburras, blue-faced honey-eaters, red-whiskered bulbuls, or straw-necked ibises. My personal favorites are the Visayan hornbills, because I generally think hornbills are amazing. This is all in all a great bird collection, and even though this house does date back to the early 60s, I think it's still holding up quite well, which of course is also due to the fact that there have been some modernizations. Unfortunately, there are no outdoor aviaries here, a problem that I also have with birdhouses in other zoos. However, a single marabou in a glass cage is something I have never seen anywhere else, and I don't know what to make of this. Elsewhere, marabous often get to live in big African savanna enclosures, and yes, they have clipped wings, which this one obviously doesn't have, but I don't think that means he's better off. By the way, up until 2019, shoebill Mausi used to live here, and just outside there is an area that suggests that she might used to get some fresh air back then, but I'm not entirely sure. Be that as it may, my thoughts around this birdhouse are mixed. However, it has to be said that I probably couldn't see the most beautiful part of it. The roof of the free flight hall was currently being renovated. Opposite the birdhouse is the monkey house, and weirdly enough on that roof sits a plane. It's a replica of the aircraft that was used in the filming of the Oscar-winning documentary Serengeti Shall Not Die, which was filmed and produced by Bernhard Chimic, the director of Zoo Frankfurt from 1945 till 1974. Zoo Frankfurt remembers him with this Chimic camp, because he is probably one of the most illustrious zoo directors in Germany. They even made a feature film about him, for crying out loud. But in order to prevent this video from getting as long as the feature film itself, let's turn our attention to the monkey house itself. There is an old school baboon rock here, although it's not quite as beautiful as the one in Cologne. Unfortunately, in my opinion, there is a lack of natural soil here, which could be fixed relatively easily. But it gets even worse, because as you can see, Pattas monkeys, capuchin, urchins and ring-tailed lemurs are still straight up living in cages. I mean, yes, of course, some cages have been combined to improve the living space, but modern animal husbandry still looks different. Inside the house, this negative impression is unfortunately only exacerbated. In my eyes, this bland tile look really symbolizes how outdated the facilities are. At least the outdoor enclosure for the brown spider monkeys is really acceptable. This tall tree offers really great natural climbing opportunities, which the spider monkeys gladly accept. And for me as a visitor, this is also a much nicer sight than having to see monkeys in old-fashioned cages. We can only hope that things will change here soon, as was already the case with the great apes in 2008. The new ape area extends over 10,000 square meters and is called Borgori Forest. Borgori is an artificial word made up of bonobo, orangutan and gorilla, so you already know which three species of apes are being kept here. In particular, the orangutans were a delight to watch on my visit. These two youngsters were playing and fooling around the whole time, so I was able to film some really great videos. And I think they also demonstrate quite well why it's not a bad idea to keep orangutans under a net. The same also applies for the bonobos, so their outdoor enclosure is consequently built in the same way. Only the gorilla enclosure is not covered by a net, but as the enclosure is relatively large, it was still possible to build some good climbing structures in the middle. But these outdoor enclosures are not only well designed for their inhabitants, I also think they are just visually appealing and they offer good viewing opportunities to observe the animals. And yes, I was also impressed by the interior of the house. The animals' indoor enclosures are spacious. The relatively dense vegetation really does create a bit of a rainforest atmosphere. The humid climate does the rest, especially when you go upstairs to see the orangutan enclosure from above. Believe me, the air is really hot up there. But it was worth it because I was able to film a sleeping binturong. Because yes, these viverrids are living together with the orangutans, which I think is quite unique, while the co-housing of gorillas and red-caped mangabeys is perhaps not quite so unusual. If I'm informed correctly, there were actually plans to house gorillas with mandrills, black and white colobuses and Diana monkeys. Now that would have been spectacular, but nevertheless the Borgori Forest is definitely one of the highlights in this zoo. Also thanks to many little things like this transition where the gorillas can move between their two indoor enclosures. And I would even go so far to say that Frankfurt has a real contender here for having the third best great ape complex in Germany after Leipzig and Rostock. But unfortunately, immediately afterwards we are reminded again that Frankfurt really still has a lot of legacy issues. The former Elephant House is one of the zoo's oldest buildings and was converted into a Rhino House in 1984. Until last year you could meet Kalusho here, the last South Central black rhinoceros in Europe. Unfortunately, at the impressive age of 37, he had to be euthanized in December of 2023. I was very lucky to see him one more time, so that I can really show him to you guys, because Kalusho was not just a true character here in Zoo Frankfurt, he also made an invaluable contribution for the preservation efforts of his critically endangered species. He fathered a total of 3 daughters, all of whom were released into the wild in Africa. Now only Hippo Lady Petra stays in the Rhino House, and it remains to be seen if rhinos will have a comeback in Frankfurt. The new master plan for Zoo Frankfurt is scheduled to be presented shortly and definitely includes a completely redesigned African area. That's a good thing, because this way of keeping the animals was or is not really up for modern standards. Again, we have a plain tile look inside the house house, which above all is more a nuisance for visitors. But in terms of the hippopotamus, the pools, both inside and outside the house, are simply far too small. And even a relatively large land area is only of limited comfort, because while pygmy hippos actually spend a relatively large amount of time on land, large hippos spend around 16 hours a day in the water. And even though they spend most of their time resting there, this is not exactly a lot of water for such a large animal. But in the knowledge that hopefully a lot will happen here in the coming years, we move on past the bird of prey enclosure, where various species of birds of prey have been kept for over 100 years. The current residents, Egyptian vultures, beteleurs, king vultures, and striated caracaras, live in aviaries that have since been merged, enlarged, and modernized. Opposite Parma wallabies and cassowaries live around the former ostrich house, where we continue our tour past the flamingos on the other side. However, we ignore the seal cliffs for the time being, walk past the West Caucasian turs and the porcupines to finally go back for the Exotarium. On its facade there's already a hidden clue which very special animals used to live here. Because here, where now a new mangrove enclosure is being built, you could once see Antarctic penguins. Even without them, the lower floor of the Exotarium has a lot to offer, especially numerous freshwater and saltwater fish. From native species such as carp or rudd to exotic river dwellers like pacus, occulate river stingrays, lungfish, or, of course, piranhas, to colorful coral reef inhabitants, there really is a lot to discover here. I was particularly fascinated by the octopuses. Just seeing and filming one of them grabbing a snack was extremely cool. The yellow-spotted river turtles can already be seen down here, but reptile lovers really get their money's worth on the upper floor. Apart from quite a few other turtles and tortoises, you can mostly see a lot of lizards in numerous terrariums. A few examples are Philippine sailfin lizards, black hardoons, chakwallas, Baya blue rock lizards, or panther chameleons. With its red coloration, this one signaled that it was a little bit aggressive. Of course, there are also some snakes to see here, such as western hognose snakes, Barron's green racers, or ball pythons. And yes, there are also some species that you can barely see anywhere else. Giant girdled lizards can only be found 6 times in Europe, McDougall's spiny lizards only 3 times, and Jamaican iguanas, one of the most endangered reptiles in the world, are otherwise only kept at Zoo Leipzig. Nevertheless, many will certainly be particularly impressed by the Australian freshwater crocodiles. Fortunately, their enclosure is not really as small as it might seem here. In fact, they share a fairly large area at the back of the Exotarium with pig-nosed turtles. However, as free-range animals, the geckos have the most space, as they have the whole floor at their disposal. Before we leave the Exotarium again, there is also a small area for insects, which, as the most species-rich class of animals, are definitely underrepresented in zoos. And Frankfurt unfortunately only shows the same species that you usually get to see in zoos, if they even have insects. The only exception are perhaps the bizarre-looking wandering violin mantises. And yet, of course, it must be noted that the Exotarium is a very species-rich house and therefore still has a lot to offer. Even if you can certainly notice that the reopening after the Second World War in 1957 was a while ago now, and the house has a few years under its belt. In contrast, the seal cliffs that lie below the Exotarium were only built in the early 2000s. Brown fur seals and harbor seals live here in a quite beautiful setting in my opinion. One reason for this is the excellent combination of artificial rocks and real stones. In the two pools, which hold 800 cubic meters and 400 cubic meters of water respectively, there are of course also underwater views where you can observe the seals diving to depth of up to 4 meters. I was also pleased to see that these enclosures do have some natural soil, which even with newer seal enclosures is definitely not a given. The Humboldt penguin enclosure is seamlessly connected to the seal cliffs, so seamlessly in fact that it's hard to believe that this enclosure was only added in 2019. Previously there were also plans to bring back Antarctic penguins, which however could not be realized. Instead, this very impressive Humboldt penguin enclosure was created, again with great views both above water and, obviously, underwater. And with a land area of 410 square meters and a pool that holds 435 cubic meters of water, this enclosure definitely has a lot to offer for the penguins themselves. And I must also mention that the view of the large pond behind it is also conceptually done very well. Areas like this are really giving me a lot of hope for the further development of the zoo. However, the rest of the park is characterized by classic old-school hoofed animal enclosures. Passing the Bactrian camels and the goats in the petting zoo, we next come to the Giraffe House, which you can tell was built in 1953. When the weather plays along, the giraffes have a perfectly acceptable outdoor enclosure at their disposal, which of course is no comparison to the fact that these animals are often kept in large Africa communal enclosures. But the real problem here is definitely the house itself. It has very little to do with modern free-range halls, which fortunately you see more and more often nowadays. But let me remind you that the new master plan will include a new African area, and I firmly believe that there will also be some changes for the giraffes. For example, the zebras are currently living in an enclosure next door, and they could more or less just combine those two. And perhaps it will then be possible to breed again in Frankfurt, because currently all zebras and giraffes are mares, although such pure mare groups are also very important for the overall concept of a conservation breeding program. In addition to the giraffes themselves, other animals also live in and around the giraffe house, including the cute Kirksdickdicks and the beautiful okapis, which I'm always so delighted to see. Keeping okapis and breeding them has a long tradition in Frankfurt. Bernhard Chimic brought the very first okapi to Germany in 1954, and in 1960 the first German okapi was successfully bred here. Since then, more than 25 okapis have been born here, and I thought for a moment that I had reason enough to tell you all about the birds and the bees, but in the end it didn't happen. On the other side of the giraffe enclosure you can find bongos, which I found to be also very beautiful, and red riverhawks who live here together. Even more remarkable are the yellow-backed duikers, because in all of Europe they can otherwise only be found in Nuremberg, Wuppertal and in Zoopark Bouval in France. And for hoofed animal lovers there are also tufted deers, which you can find by the seal cliffs, where I almost overlooked them entirely. And finally we head back to South America, because past the communal enclosure for vicuñas, capybaras, rhias and Patagonian maras, we are heading for the exit, or perhaps rather the conclusion, which has to be kind of mixed. Unfortunately, Zoo Frankfurt still has a lot of legacy issues, a huge construction backlog, a lot of enclosures where something needs to be done. And there is a plausible reason for that, because there's been far too much discussion here whether the zoo should remain at its current location or whether it should be moved to the outskirts of the city, where of course there would have been much more space. The zoo is located at the eastern edge of the city center. Everything around it is completely built up so that the area of 11 hectares or 27 acres can definitely not be expanded. The decision to stay here anyway might be the right one, but it also means that modernization must certainly be accompanied by a decline in the species population. In 2022, Frankfurt Zoo was home to 5,326 individuals of 467 species. And I cannot deny that, in my opinion, this richness in species also defines and characterizes Zoo Frankfurt. In this respect, I'm very curious to see how a good compromise can be found here. All the new enclosures that were built here in the last few years really make me optimistic and are also the main reason why I can definitely recommend a visit to Zoo Frankfurt despite all the legacy issues. Especially as I have to emphasize a really good price-performance ratio here. There really are some zoos that charge far more for far less. Perhaps my conclusion here is too mild in the end. I'm not sure. Let me know in the comments. Tell me what you think of Zoo Frankfurt. I'm really looking forward to read everything you have to say, unless you want to complain about my German accent. I really would appreciate if you would hit the thumbs up button if you liked the video, hit subscribe, ring the bell. All of that helps me out a lot. I want to continue to give you as many zoo impressions as I can, but therefore this channel has to be somewhat successful, so I'm really appreciative of all your help. Thank you guys so much. See you soon. Auf Wiedersehen. Yours truly, Morten. Do I have to say that in English as well? I guess so, right? I guess so. I mean, can I say Martin? Can you say Martin? It sounds so much better than Morten. I don't like it.